The women's suffrage movement was officially born at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York State in 1848. However, the women and men who gathered there had been involved in other pre-Civil War reform movements, including temperance and the abolition of slavery, and the women's suffrage movement flowed naturally from those roots. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton attended the Anti-Slavery Convention in London with her husband in 1840, women were not granted seats or allowed to speak. There, in the background, literally, Stanton met another American woman, Lucretia Mott. The two decided they needed to hold a women's rights convention in the U.S. On July 19 and 20, 1848, between 200 and 300 people attended the first Women's Rights Convention organized by Stanton and Mott. On the first day of the convention, a Declaration of Sentiments was read. On day 2, men were invited and over 40 attended, including Frederick Douglass. The 12 resolutions in the Declaration of Sentiments were passed, including the 9th resolution proclaiming a woman's right to vote. A portion of the Declaration of Sentiments is as follows.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their own safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are far more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the form to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. Now, in the view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. In entering upon the great work before us, we anticipate no small amount of misconception, misrepresentation, and ridicule, but we shall use every instrumentality within our power to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislatures, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and the press on our behalf. We hope this convention will be followed by a series of conventions embracing every part of the country.
Sojourner Truth was an impressive and articulate escaped slave who spoke out regularly for women's rights and against slavery. Born in New York in 1797 as Isabella Baumfree, she escaped from slavery in 1826. After becoming a Methodist in 1843, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth and began touring the country speaking at conventions and other gatherings. In May 1851, she attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention and delivered this short yet powerful speech advocating for women's rights.
I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. Well, I can carry as much as any man, and eat as much too, if I can get it. I'm as strong as any man. As for intellect, all I can say is if a woman has a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pintful? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we won't take more than our pint'll hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You will have your own rights and they won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible and have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if woman upset the world, shouldn't we give her a chance to set it right side up again? The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God, who created him, and woman who bore him. So man, where is your part? But the women are coming up. Blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming up on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard.
For the 1876 Independence Day ceremony in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 5 members of the women's suffrage movement, including Susan B. Anthony, were given platform passes to observe the proceedings, but were denied the chance to present their declaration. After Senator Richard Henry Lee finished reading the original Declaration of Independence, the women quickly moved to the front of the platform, and Anthony read their declaration to the surprised senator. The women then left the platform and distributed copies of the Declaration to people on the stage and in the crowd. Here is an excerpt from this declaration written by Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on behalf of the National Women's Suffrage Association.
The history of our country the past 100 years has been a series of assumptions and usurpations of power over women in direct opposition to the principles of just government, acknowledged by the United States as its foundation, which are, first, the natural rights of each individual; second, the equality of these rights; third, that rights not delegated are retained by the individual; fourth, that no person can exercise the rights of others without delegated authority; fifth, that the non-use of rights does not destroy them. And for the violation of these fundamental principles of our government, we arraign our rulers on this 4th day of July, 1876. And these are our articles of impeachment. These articles of impeachment against our rulers, we now submit to the impartial judgment of the people. To all these wrongs and oppressions, women have not submitted in silence and resignation. From the beginning of the century, when Abigail Adams, the wife of one president and mother of another, said, "We will not hold ourselves bound to obey laws in which we have no voice or representation." Until now, women's discontent has been steadily increasing, culminating nearly 30 years ago in a simultaneous movement among the women of the nation, demanding the rights of suffrage. In making our just demands a higher motive than the pride of sex inspires us, we feel that national safety and stability depend on the complete recognition of the broad principles of our government. Women's degraded, helpless position is the weak point in our institutions today, a disturbing force everywhere, severing family ties, filling our asylums with the deaf, the dumb, the blind, our prisons with criminals, our cities with drunkenness and prostitution, our homes with disease and death. It was the boast of the founders of the Republic that the rights for which they contended were the rights of human nature. If these rights are ignored in the case of one half of the people, the nation is surely preparing for its downfall. Governments try themselves. The recognition of a governing and governed class is incompatible with the first principles of freedom. Women have not been a heedless spectator of the events of this century, nor a dull listener to the grand arguments for the equal rights of humanity. From the earliest history of our country, women have shown equal devotion with man to the cause of freedom and have stood firmly by his side in its defense. Together, they have made the country what it is. Women's wealth, thought, and labor have cemented the stones of every monument man has raised to liberty. And now, at the close of 100 years, as the hour hand of the great clock that marks the centuries points to 1876, we declare our faith in the principles of self-government, our full equality with man in natural rights, that woman was made first for her own happiness, with the absolute right to herself, to all the opportunities and advantages life affords for her complete development. And we deny that dogma of the centuries, incorporated in the codes of all nations, that woman was made for man, her best interest in all cases to be sacrificed to his will. We ask of our rulers at this hour no special favors, no special privileges, no special legislation. We ask justice. We ask equality. We ask that all the civil and political rights that belong to citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us and our daughters forever.
Frederick Douglass was one of 40 men present at the Women's Rights Convention held at Seneca Falls, New York in July 1848. An escaped slave and a self-educated man, Douglass was an eloquent speaker and the most famous black man of his day. His support for women's rights never wavered, although in 1869 he publicly disagreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who called for women's suffrage simultaneously with voting rights for black men. Douglass argued that prejudice and violence against black men made their need for the franchise more pressing. Nonetheless, Douglass remained a constant champion of the right of women to vote. In May 1888, in a speech at the 20th annual meeting of the New England Women's Suffrage Association in Boston, Douglass spoke about his continued support for women's suffrage. Here is an excerpt from his moving speech.
While I esteem it an honor to stand on this New England women's suffrage platform, I do not feel that I have the right to the prominence you have been pleased to give me in this your proceedings by calling me at this time. It is perhaps about time that I should decline to be a speaker on occasions like the present. Having survived the anti-slavery conflict and lived to rejoice in the victory over slavery and being no longer as young as I once was, I am a little too late for efficiency and prominence in the great cause you have in hand. My special mission in the world, if I ever had any, was the emancipation and enfranchisement of the Negro. Mine was a great cause. Yours is a much greater cause, since it comprehends the liberation and elevation of one half of the whole human family. Happily, however, I have two good reasons for coming upon this platform tonight. The first is, I live near the city of Washington. Not a very strong reason, perhaps, but I come to you from an atmosphere largely pervaded with the women's suffrage sentiment, and I am so much in sympathy with it that it is more difficult to be silent than to speak in its favor. In the second place, this cause has a valid claim upon my, quote, service and labor, unquote, outside of its merits. The New England Women's Suffrage Association is composed in part of a noble woman who dared to speak for the freedom of the slave at a time when it required far more courage to do so than it was required to speak in the women's suffrage cause at this day.
In 1900, Susan B. Anthony stepped down as the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and Carrie Chapman Catt took the reins. At the 32nd Annual Convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Washington, D.C., Catt, as the newly elected president, delivered a speech on the closing day of the convention.
There are a few fanatics who, if they could, would force the women of this generation back into the spheres of their grandmothers. There are some pessimists who imagine they see all natural order coming to a speedy end because of the enlarged liberties and opportunities of women. There are sentimentalists who believe that the American home, that most sacred unit of society, is seriously imperiled by the tendencies of women to adopt new duties and interests. But this is not the thought of the average American. There are few intelligent men who would be willing to provide their daughters no more education than was deemed proper for their grandmothers, or who would care to restrict them to the old-time limited sphere of action. Thinking men and women realize that the American home was never more firmly established than at the present time, and that it has grown nobler and happier as women have grown more self-reliant. The average man and woman recognize that the changes which have come in the interest of better womanhood and better manhood, bringing the greater happiness to women and greater blessings to men. They recognize that each step gained has rendered women fitter companions for men, wiser mothers, and far abler units of society. The public acknowledges the wisdom, the common sense, the practical judgment of the woman movement until it asks for the suffrage. In other words, it approves every right gained because it is here, and condemns the one right not yet gained because it is not here. Had it been either custom or statutory law which forbade women to vote, the suffrage would have been won by the same processes which have gained every other privilege. A few women would have voted, a few men and women would have upheld them, and little by little, year after year, the number of women electors would have increased until it became as general for women to vote as it is for men. Had this been possible, the women would be voting today in every state in the Union, and undoubtedly their appearance at the polls would now be as generally accepted as a matter of fact as the college education. But alas, when the step of advancement was proposed, women found themselves face to face with the stone wall of constitutional law, and they could not vote until a majority of men should first give their consent. Indeed, the experiment was made to gain this sacred privilege by easier means. The history of the voting of Susan B. Anthony and others is familiar to all, but the Supreme Court decided that the national constitution must first be amended. It therefore becomes a necessity to convert to this reform a majority of the men of the whole United States. When we recall the vast amount of illiteracy, ignorance, selfishness, and degradation which exists among certain classes of our people, the task imposed upon us is appalling. There are whole precincts of voters in this country whose united intelligence does not equal that of one representative American woman. Yet to such classes as these, we are asked to take our cause as the court of final resort. We are compelled to petition men who have never heard of the Declaration of Independence and who have never read the Constitution for the sacred right of self-government. We are forced to appeal for justice to men who do not know the meaning of the word. We are driven to argue our claim with men who have never had two thoughts in logical sequence. We ask these men to consider the rights of a citizen in a republic, and we get the answer in reply, given in all seriousness: women have more rights now than they ought to have. And that, too, without the faintest notion of the inanity of the remark or the emptiness of the brain behind it. When we present our cause to men of higher standing and more liberal opinion, we find that the interest of party and the personal ambition for place are obstacles which prevent them from approving a question concerning whose popularity there is the slightest doubt. The way before us is difficult at best, not because our demand is not based upon unquestioned justice, not because it is not destined to win in the end, but because of the nature of the processes through which it must be won. In fact, the position of this question might well be used to demonstrate that observation of Aristotle that a democracy has many striking points of resemblance with tyranny. It is for these reasons, gentlemen, that we appeal to your committee to aid in the submission of a 16th Amendment. Such an amendment would go before the legislatures of our country, where the grade of intelligence is at least higher than we should find in the popular vote. Though you yourselves may doubt the expediency of women's suffrage, though you may question the soundness of our claim, yet in the name of democracy, which permits the people to make and amend their constitutions, and in the name of American womanhood, prepared by a century of unmeasured advance for political duties, we beg your aid in the speedy submission of this question. We ask this boon in the direct interest of the thousands of women who do want to vote, who suffer pangs of humiliation and degradation because of their political servitude. We ask it equally in the indirect interest of the thousands of women who do not want to vote, as we believe their indifference or opposition is the same natural conservatism which led other women to oppose the college education, the control of property, the freedom of public speech, and the right of organization. Years ago, George William Curtis pleaded for fair play for women. It is the same plea we are repeating. We only petition for fair play, and this means a submission of our question to the most intelligent constituency which has the power to act upon it. If we shall fail, we will abide by the decision. That is, we will wait till courage has grown stronger, reason more logical, justice purer, in the positive knowledge that our cause will eventually triumph. As the daughters of Zelophehad appealed to Moses and his great court for justice, so do the daughters of America appeal to you.
A progressive social reformer and activist, Jane Addams was on the front line of the settlement house movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She later became internationally respected for the peace activism that ultimately won her a Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, the first American woman to receive this honor. She was also among the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. In addition, Addams became active in the women's suffrage movement and served as vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1911 to 1914. On June 17, 1911, she delivered a speech on women's suffrage, excerpted here.
It's always very difficult for me to make a speech on women's suffrage. I always feel that it belongs to the last century rather than this. The men who foresaw that the Negroes would need the protection of the ballot ought to have given it to the women. The best of them, like Theodore Parker and Abraham Lincoln, were concerned when they saw women going into industry without it. The 18th century was a century of big theories and much discussion about them. Today, things have changed. Now we are looking after all sorts of minute and pressing things. And when we would lay our hands on that little mechanism, the ballot, not because we want to talk about it, but because we need to use it, it is embarrassing to find that we have not got it. It is annoying to have to stop in the midst of our social work and realize that we cannot pass important measures till we obtain a vote, and that we must start parades and hold meetings, and maybe throw things before we get it. But our method of approach to it may be useful. The ballot may arrive as function grows by pushing on the organism. It may come like a thief in the night. At every turn, we are brought up to the desire to have a vote. Almost every subject in which women are interested leads right up to it. When I am asked to give the reasons why women should have the ballot, the reasons are too many to name. I had a lecture once, illustrating them in detail. I have almost forgotten it now, though I gave it many times. It showed why any women in Chicago, Italian, Bohemian, or Jewish, needed the vote. I had my illustrations all along the line, attaching her to the city government by her need of dry basements and of fire escapes, to the state government by her need of laws regulating hours of labor in factories, and to the national government by her need of pure food for her family, etc. Foreign-born women in my neighborhood are always asking me why women do not vote at the municipal election in Chicago, as they do in so many of the countries from which they come, England, Ireland, Scandinavia, etc. I am at a loss how to answer them. I believe it is simply because of tradition, because, way back, it was considered unladylike to take part in government, in the days when government was concerned mainly with the seizing and keeping of loot. The ballot is such a simple device and so far away from the clashing of shields. Yet we cannot get away from that old idea. But if we keep on straining to the extent of our powers, this tradition will break down, as it is already breaking here and there and everywhere. I don't believe in urging a man to vote against his convictions. I don't even believe in trying too hard to persuade him by using that moral compulsion which moralists exert when they are feeling especially moral. The problems of our time will be solved only when all the best minds, conscience, and talent in the community are brought to their solution. We are no longer called upon to deal with the great abstractions of the 18th century. We must have the humbler task of pushing forward the utilitarian side, but the utilitarian side in its highest sense. When people realize that the highest interests of the city cannot be secured and preserved except by the cooperation of men and women in government, I think we shall be surprised by the quick way in which the franchise will come into our hands.
What does the vote mean to me is an interesting question because I think I never really thought about it much as one of the benefits of being born in a time where it's just handed to me. It always felt more like a responsibility, but a good responsibility.
The right to vote, to me, is actually voting and expressing how we want our society to be.
It is an honor and a privilege to be able to vote, especially with women, what they had to go through for themselves and for minorities to be able to vote.
When I was little growing up, my mom always took me with her to vote. It was the polling place in Oakland, was one of our neighbors' house. We used to go and stand in the garage, and I got to be there with my mom. So since my daughter was born, I've taken her to vote with me every single time.
To be able to support education, that's such a fundamental right that matters to all of us. Our children need to be educated.
I'm old enough that I wasn't allowed to register until I was 21. But I immediately registered as soon as I turned 21, and I haven't missed an election yet.
I plan to send in a vote. I get them in the mail, and I've done that for the last quite a few years now. I've voted by mail. So I will vote.